a very interesting conversation that I'm going to be having, and I know that given the two members I've just heard on a panel discussion here in Carlton Gardens are just incredibly not just humorous but sensitive to the emotions of people, and of course perhaps are the ones to talk about whether there are limits to freedom of speech. Martin and Naiza, both of them artists. Naiza has her studio for the last 24 years in Karachi, and Martin has probably the reputation of getting the nose and the eyes and the eyebrows of David Cameron and several other political readers right with his cartoons, and also as a writer. Thanks very much indeed for talking to us. The question is, Martin, I'm just curious. You on a daily basis create these pieces of art, which obviously at many other times are seen as offensive, and that's meant to be that way. How many times have you had to redo something because you thought, no, this might just offend somebody?
I mean, it very rarely happens, because in Britain we have 300 years of uninterrupted visual satire. So we're actually part of the political conversation. And it's a strange thing, but politicians in this country, if they complained about a cartoon, they would expose themselves to the unforgivable sin in British culture and British society, which is suggesting they have no sense of humour. And it's incredibly powerful position we're in, because they can't admit to it. If they object to it, they think, oh, you can't take it, you're not strong enough, you're too wimpy. And I know there are certain politicians absolutely hate what we do to them, but they can never admit it. They can never say, you know, well, luckily they can never say lock him up. They do that in other countries. So
fortunate, you feel?
I think it's very fortunate. I mean, I know there's a good friend of mine, a Malaysian cartoonist called Zunar, who's currently facing 43 years in prison for sedition. But so.
Yeah. In fact, we have the reputation of having a chief minister who's filed in India, who's filed the maximum number of defamation cases against people who she thought had written offensive articles as well as given offensive cartoons. But very rarely, he says. That comes to me as a surprise, because I would have imagined that the answer to that would have been very often, given the sensitive society and the different fabrics we live in and trying to appease and please everybody.
What it is because I'm attacking those in power. I afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted. I don't kick down, I always kick up. I always attack people more powerful than me. And actually, you know, I'm in a pretty powerful position. So you look pretty foolish if you start up a huge wave of a Twitter row or something like that to protect the sensitivities of the British finance minister, you know, as opposed to protecting the sensitivities of a particular group of people who are disadvantaged. So I'm not going to be attacking them anyway, because I'm not that kind of cartoonist.
But you get attacked too. You hit the death threats. How do you deal with that?
Oh, well, death threats by email. It's because we have this wonderful cyber age, means that in the old days people had to go and buy some green ink, they had to go and write it out, they had to find a stamp, they had to find the address of the newspaper, they had to walk down to the post box and then post it, and most people gave up when they couldn't find a stamp. Now you just have kids. I mean, I've got stuff, I know they're from kids in their bedrooms in the Rockies, and they don't know where London is, they haven't got a passport, but they just send an obscene message and press send, and they think there's no comeback. And that's the revolting thing about the modern age, is people can behave like mobs anonymously in the digital realm. But you just...
So what do? Do you just cool off, you just have green tea and think about the next word?
I press the delete button.
Okay. Very important advice indeed. Naiza Khan, you have had a lot of work your work has been in terms of gender neutrality, gender equality back there in Pakistan. I would imagine you impose a level of self-restraint given the background, given the place you belong to and where your art is majorly seen.
Well, I think definitely you have to see what the boundaries are, you have to see what the lines are, and often in a place like Pakistan and within the art world, because it's really below the radar of a lot of scrutiny, which is a good thing for many reasons. I feel that you don't know where the line is. There's no spoken, written line, this is what you cannot do, which possibly would be easier to deal with if that were the case. But I think as an artist, one is constantly negotiating that invisible line, and often artists do come up against it and, you know, hit their head against that wall, and often, you know, that's quite injurious to their careers or to themselves or whatever project they're doing. So I think you have to kind of constantly test the waters, and I don't think you can live in that kind of la-la land that, you know, it's going to be all right, and that I think more and more I sense that, you know, you have to be more vigilant, you have to be more careful about what you're saying and what you're doing in your work. And I have seen, you know, artworks, artists having a hard time often with that invisible line.
Sure. You personally, have you had to redo something? In your own mind, have you thought something could be offensive?
I think it's a luxury to be an artist, to work in your studio, and there's a privacy and a sort of a security in that.
Yes. Until the time your work is exposed.
Yes, and then until the time it's exposed. I've often worked with images in my studio which I would look at and I would say, this is never going to see the light of day, I'm just putting it in the drawer and that's it. But I have to do it because it's part of my journey, it's part of the, you know, the bridge I have to cross to get to the other side. You know, surprisingly, a year or 2 or 3 years later, the work will be shown. It'll be shown in Karachi, in Pakistan, and sometimes internationally as well. So I'm quite surprised by that. I think it's also my own level of comfort of feeling that, okay, I think it's all right for me to be able to defend it, to be able to stand up and talk about it, whereas before it would have been too personal or too intimate to sort of say, yes, you know, I've just done it, and yes, and it's going to be.
Yeah,
Yes.
I just want to say, that certainly I've been a cartoonist now for 30 years, and certainly in the last 15 to 20 years, there's been a change in the atmosphere that you constantly find yourself having to navigate between two equally ludicrous positions. The first of which is I should have the complete freedom to say whatever I like about whomever I choose, whenever I want to. Which is nonsense, because that's not how society works. If you went around, you know, there's always the gag about if people tell the truth all the time, society would break down in mayhem and murder. But that's on one side, which is a ludicrous position. Now, on the other side is that my greatest human right, which trumps all other human rights and overrides everybody else's human right, is my freedom from being upset. And this is nonsense. There are all these people who are saying, but you've upset me. Well, you know, life is upsetting. I'm upset by the fact that I'm not given £100 notes as I walk down the street by total strangers, but there's not much I can do about it. So you just get on with your life.
Sure. Would you, well, you can't really get away with, in Britain, given the sense of humor, the standard of sense of humor that the country has set. Would you trade that, the country that you work in, would you trade that for anything else?
I'm too old to change my ways, but of course, you know, what I do, political cartoons, political satire, and this kind of thing, it's universal. It's everywhere. And, I mean, even in the most repressive countries you can imagine, there are brilliant visual satirists. They just can't attack their governments, but they attack other governments, you know. So in the Soviet Union, they had brilliant cartoonists.
Yes.
In Iran, they have brilliant cartoonists.
Sure.
And
So would it be right then to say that art, which otherwise we say has no boundary indeed, does have boundaries?
well, of course it does. Everything has a boundary. If something has no boundaries, you can't tell what it is because it hasn't got an outline.
And you?
Yes, absolutely. I think art has boundaries, and you have to constantly push the boundary.